That viperous pig. I thought I saw you in here, Tristan. It's been so long, huh? A particularly peppy brunette with indigo streaks was leaning against one of the store's shelves, indicating she was just there for however long Tristan was getting that useless reading. It seemed to Tristan that she showed an almost impressive amount of restraint and patience to just stay out of the back room, especially with how full of herself she really was. Tristan's eyes narrowed into a dagger-like glare, making it openly clear that this girl was definitely not someone she wanted to see. Aw, what? No hello? You really need to be nicer to your best friends. Although I never took you as a mystic type. I mean, I know what you do, but still. What are you doing here, Jocelyn? Tristan demanded, not refraining from her dislike spilling over into her tone. The girl didn't lose her irritating smile. Then her bright green eyes suddenly caught sight of something beside Tristan. Then she let out an unruly squeal. I didn't know cats were allowed in here. What's its name? It looks so odd. Cat? Tristan frowned at the way the witch's head perked at this with a near outraged expression. What cat? Where? Who brought that dreadful beast into my store? Tristan looked away slightly, not speaking in order to retain her innocence with the suddenly different and more furious store owner. Wow, seriously? You're as blind as a bat. You might want to consider getting some new prescriptions, because you're going to end up hurt one of these days. Jocelyn spoke in an affable chirrup, but even Tristan wasn't the only one who caught on to the mean-spirited undertone. I've had enough. You both are banned from my store. Never come back. Get out. Now! What? But you and I had a deal. Tristan rounded on the witch in disbelief, eyes wide and wild in her outrage. Why was she getting kicked out along with that viper? But the usually dead fire within Tristan, that had started to just blaze out of all control within her, was just as quickly snuffed out at the shockingly scary, piercing blue eyes that the witch was more than happy to return in kind. I reserve my right to refuse service. Now get the hell out of my store. Now! As soon as Tristan and the other girl stepped out into the outside, the witch was quick to slam the door on them, nearly missing from crushing Zarina's tail from between the door frame and the door, and also dramatically pulled the curtain on them in every window of the store. Wow, she's quite the peach, isn't she? No wonder this place is blacklisted and up for sale. Don't worry, she'll be out of work soon enough. Tristan didn't respond in any way at her nonchalant input, just struggling terribly against wringing this bitch's neck. She just ruined her one easy chance at purchasing crystals without the hassle, but she should have expected it wouldn't turn out that way. After all, her life was a crock of shit anyway. Silently, Tristan turned on her heel and began her walk back home, not looking to see if Zarina was following her or not. She knew Zarina could see it all very well, but she did hope she was, as many thoughts of Jocelyn's true nature swamped her initial minimal peace of mind. Her ear twitched at the huff of disappointment she heard from the bitch, and Tristan felt goosebumps spread over her skin at the slight rub she felt from Zarina's curly fur. An image of Jocelyn trying to pet Zarina entered her mind, and she began to smile to herself with a swell of satisfaction. Zarina picked her. You know, Miss Tristan, I have to respect your bravery. Tristan paused, a new emotion jolting through her system before getting instantly stamped out of existence. She didn't turn around, but Jocelyn continued, knowing she had gotten her attention. You know how dangerous it is for people like us to have pets. It'd be a shame if you found out about it, don't you think? She stayed silent in response to this, clenching her jaw at what she perceived as an oncoming threat. She's not mine. She just follows me around, Tristan stated placidly, playing to the lie that she wasn't emotionally connected to Zarina. Oh? So then you wouldn't mind if she joined us for our meeting tonight? Tonight? Tristan turned this time in confusion. This was too soon. Something's happened. And she hated how she wasn't told before this bitch that they were meeting up. What's happening? Oh, you haven't heard? Mr. Carson had a sudden realization, so he wants all of us back to the meeting trees to tell us. Tristan didn't like this. Not at all. But she knew better than to go against their leader's word, especially if it's of spontaneity. So, without another word to the viper's bitch, she turned on her heel and began her route to the meeting grounds in the dark forest. The bitch commented with a pout that her cat was starting to leave, but she didn't answer that in any way. With the way she was now, Zarina knew she'd only cause problems if she were to follow Tristan anywhere near the meeting place. Perhaps that was better than having this girl accompany her there, she thought, as this bitch did nothing but yak all the way to the dark forest about pointless topics she cared nothing about. And it wasn't like Tristan could escape into her own head either. As many scenarios of this bitch doing what sneaky bitches do and just causing her death in numerous different morbid ways played into her mind. She decided her mind had chosen that moment to be paranoid and start running away from her. So her best bet was to look even closer at the scenery and environment around her. Everything was darker and more ominous looking, and she noticed there was no sign of a firelight at all, which normally indicated their gathering. Her eyes narrowed at the strangeness of the situation, but her mind detached from the worst-case scenarios. But she stopped in her tracks when she first stepped into a clearing and found there was no one from her group in sight at all. "What is this?" Tristan glowered, starting to think that what her brain was telling her was probably not too far off from the situation after all. "Oh, don't worry. Mr. Carson and the others just haven't prepared for the offering yet. They'll be here soon enough." She grinned her sickeningly sweet smile that her piercing green eyes didn't meet. It was then that Tristan opened herself up to seeing exactly what her mind was trying to tell her, but it had become more like flashes in a lightning storm that came and went. It never stayed long enough to communicate what she needed to see, but as it was continuously flashing, her head started feeling a splitting headache in the making. "Come sit by the fire with me, Miss Tristan." She heard Jocelyn's voice overpower the noise already in her head, but was fascinated when all in her mind became nearly calm, and the indiscernible images ebbed off into the shadows of her mind. She was going to refuse upon first instinct, however, still not wanting to be anywhere near the girl, but as the commotion of urgent images, with additional mental voices warning her of danger she couldn't even hear or comprehend, began slowly rising inside her head again, she decided to start making her way over to the blackened charcoal pit in the middle of the dead meadow. And, in an instant, her mind fell instantly silent into white noise, and she sought to stay within the meadow to avoid the uprise of images again. She hoped her brother would get back home safe and sound after his sleepover. Soon as she was done here, she'd go straight back home and wait for him. Once she reached the fire pit, she stood off to the side as Jocelyn had sat down onto the gritty ash-scattered earth. And as silence settled upon the both of them, Tristan got lost inside her own thoughts again, and stayed there for several minutes as she didn't notice Jocelyn's phone ding with a notification, and Jocelyn smiled in excitement when she read it, and put her device away giddily. "I know you heard me say this before, but I was serious when I said I respected you." Tristan blinked back to reality when Jocelyn called her, but immediately wanted to drown out anything she had to say that was at all sweet or love-bomby. She's heard enough of that in her life, thanks very much. "Hell, I'd say I even wanted to be like you. Strong, independent, smart." While Jocelyn was lifting off positive adjectives, Tristan looked over at the first sign of life beyond the dead oak trees, and watched the rest of her group walk through the tree line and approach them with remorse and defeated expressions. This wasn't unusual to her, as those expressions were literally what their faces were each time they had a meeting. What was unusual, however, was the absence of their narcissistic leader. "I've grown tired of your games, Jocelyn. I'm not interested in whatever plans you have in your head. I'm just here because it was requested." Tristan glowered at Jocelyn, cutting off her pretty much forgettable compliments to her that she could pretty much care less about. Jocelyn stared up at her with an expression of surprise before it was replaced with a nonchalant smile. "Just as blatant as ever. That's another thing I respect you for." "What?" Before Tristan could even finish her thought, she suddenly felt hands upon her, and she was quickly shoved down onto her knees harshly. "What the hell are you doing? Get off of me! Let go!" She snapped furiously, struggling to free herself from her new enemies. But no matter how hard she tried, the hands never lessened their grips. In fact, They only tightened more painfully. What was it that you told me? When you're far enough to this point in the forest, no one is able to hear the screams from the animals? Tristan faltered in her struggling for a moment, terror flashing through her entire being as she stared shocked at the sickeningly sweet grin on Jocelyn's amused expression. It was then, as Jocelyn gestured to one of the people in the group not holding Tristan down to retrieve something from the sacrificial bag, that everything was suddenly becoming clearer and clearer to Tristan. This girl wasn't even an arrogant bitch. She was an absolute cold-hearted monster. Tristan then whipped her head around, her long black hair whipping her in the face at the abrupt motion and draping over her shoulder like heavy weights. As she watched with widened eyes, one of them pull out a rusty yet frightening kitchen knife, which glinted in the cold, chilly moonlight. That sack was usually meant for carrying the animals caught for sacrifices, never for their tools. Tristan's struggle for freedom went from fury to absolute desperation as the teen approached with the weapon in hand. Her eyes kept on it all the while, and even as it transferred to Jocelyn's own eager and twitching hands. Tristan didn't want to die. She still had so much more she wanted to do. She had to be there for her brother, too. She couldn't just leave him. She blinked her hotly tearing up eyes, and hurriedly ushered the use of her voice. In a quivering tone, she pleaded, "Jocelyn, please, don't do this. I don't want to die." Her chest racked with a sob, and her head dropped down as more tears were spilling down her face. "You disappoint me, Miss Tristan. I never thought you plead for your life when your whole reason for being in this group is because you hate yours." She practically cackled, and Tristan could only stare gobsmacked and astonished. "You see, everyone? Even the most cold and unapproachable person can still be all wallowing pathetic when it comes to losing their life, no matter how favored by the leader they are." "What? What are you talking about? I'm just like all of you. I wasn't treated any different." Her eyebrows furrowed and tone sharpened into certainty. But she winced when someone's hold on her arm tightened, and pain jolted through it. "Do you hear that, everyone? She wasn't treated any different than all of us. While we were beaten into submission, she was able to walk away free of any scars and bruises. And while all of you sacrificed your beloved pets and animals, she was able to walk away with her own cat unharmed and very much alive. I saw it with my own eyes." This caused a whole ripple of muttered outrage and disbelief, and her stomach dropped at this. "What? No! So what say you, everyone? Should we let her continue?" Protests erupted from all around Tristan, and just as she was about to speak again, desperately trying to see the passionate crowd back to reason, she was forcibly gagged and bound, then harshly shoved into the rough, ashen ground. They all talked amongst themselves about what they planned to do while she struggled and screamed in vain. But she paused when they then decided upon her fate, and even as she tried squirming to get away, their forms took on a monstrously dark black from the newly lit blaze in the sacrificial fire pit. The whole night was filled with the muffled, blood-curdling screams of agony, and the unholy laughs and chants of a collective choir of voices. It must have been several hours before the torture ended. All had become darker as the fire burning in the pit had become nothing more than tiny embers, flickering among dark abyssal black charcoal and stark white ash and smoke. Tristan laid upon the dead grass in crimson pools that grew larger and larger as she laid still. Her bare body was covered in reddish-purple bruises and numerous bleeding gashes, the amount of which she couldn't remember. She continuously slipped in and out of consciousness, and the voices of the group were little more than muffled white noise to her. She could feel her death creeping closer to her, prowling around the edges of her vision like a starving predator. And she would let it. She wasn't strong enough to do very much else. Even her brain had fogged over any and all flashes of memories to keep her alive, to keep her aware. And now all she perceived was barren and black. But even as the warmth in her body was leaving, and the shadows were drawing closer and closer, her eyes fluttered open a bit wider when she saw a bright flash of something. She would have probably written it off at first. but it came again and started to shine persistently. When she strained her eyes to focus on it a bit more, she realized the light was actually two eyes. Soon, those two eyes materialized with a small black body, and around the body, the dark forest followed into immediate focus as well. Just the sight of Zarina there was enough to drive more tears into her eyes, yet she had cried too much earlier. So she settled with sending the deity pleading eyes. Zarina's ears perked up at this, as though hearing her plea loud and clear, despite her gagged mouth, and she immediately leapt over the bush and quickly began bounding down the slope towards her. "It's her cat! There it is!" Tristan heard Jocelyn cry in alert, as all her senses seemed to start returning to her the closer Zarina got. From all the verbal beratement and abuse she was pelted with for several long hours, she knew Zarina would return for her and save her from a morbid and slow death. She didn't focus on the whole group running around confused, or the fact that the fire pit suddenly blazed back to life, with a loud crackling roar, which caused most of the group to leap back with loud screams of terror and surprise. No, she focused solely on Zarina, who had returned despite the many snide comments that she meant nothing to the deity she sold her entire being to. Zarina had proved Jocelyn wrong. When Zarina was just upon her, Tristan felt as though she had regained all of her strength and energy she lost. She felt as though, if her hands weren't bound, she'd be capable of leaping back onto her feet and running straight for home that was only several miles away without stopping. And as though hearing her thought, her bindings were suddenly loosened and undone, and she felt a surge of energy as hot as the fire that blazed, and instantly sprang to her feet. She ran as fast as she could, and pretty quickly the cries from the group got swept up in the wind that buffeted her as she ran. But even with all the wounds on her body being exposed to the chilly night air and the undergrowth she raced past and through, she felt no pain at all. Zarina had healed her like when they first met. She had to have. With all of the new feelings of rejuvenation, she sought to go home to her brother and teach him more about the dangers of people due to her experience that night. She had to protect him, especially since they knew he existed and would undoubtedly go after her again. Everything was going to be different this time. She could just feel it. However, her happy determination gave way to concern and confusion the longer she ran through the dark forest. This can't be. Surely she should have reached the parking lot by now. Perhaps she took a wrong turn? Passed by a familiar landmark without noticing? Regardless, she continued her way with the pace of a jog, just paying more attention to the never-ending trees for any indication that she was going the right way to her desired destination. But she soon came upon some familiar landmarks indeed, but not the one she was looking for at all.